Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're taking a look at the history of the Métis people in Western Canada. Um, I have to say, the sources you sent over are a real mix. Textbooks, study guides, even some primary quotes. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's quite the collection, but it really seems like you want to go beyond the basic facts, right?
Yeah,
Get a feel for how the Métis, created their own unique space and the obstacles they faced along the way.
exactly. I mean, their story is such a vital part of Canadian history, and yet I feel like it's often glossed over.
Absolutely. So let's dig into these sources and really understand how the Métis emerged, not just as a people of mixed heritage, but as a distinct group with their own culture, economy, and traditions.
All right. Well, a lot of the sources point to the fur trade as, well, the origin point for that distinct Métis identity. We're talking about children of First Nations women, primarily Cree or Anishinaabe, and European fur traders. A lot of those traders were French or Scottish, right?
Right. But it's important to note this wasn't just about who your parents were. The Métis didn't just sort of inherit two cultures side by side. They blended them, they adapted, they created something totally new.
And a perfect example of that, something that really stood out to me in the sources, is their language
Yeah.
shift. It's incredible. It's not just a simplified mix, it's complex, drawing from French, Cree,
Uh-huh.
even English, a real linguistic tapestry reflecting their blended heritage.
For sure. And think about their economy too, right? The Métis were known for their skills in the fur trade, absolutely, but also as buffalo hunters, expert horsemen. They adapted European farming methods to the Red River lots, creating their own agricultural system,
Yeah.
really mastering survival and adaptation in a tough environment.
Yeah, one of the sources even quotes a fur trader, William McGillivray, is back in 1818, and he said the Métis saw themselves as an independent tribe of natives. It's a really striking quote, especially for that time period.
Yeah, that idea of self-reliance is crucial. The Metis created their own councils, they had their own systems of justice, often based on traditional practices, and they were incredibly protective of their autonomy. Even their name in Cree, Otipamisiwak, translates to the people who govern themselves. That theme of self-governance, of independence, it runs throughout their history.
So we have this image of vibrant, adaptable people really forging their own path. But it's clear from the sources that large-scale European settlement, well, that brought conflict.
Yeah, and I think to understand that conflict, we have to try to understand the different perspectives and goals involved. For the Métis, the land was their home, their livelihood, the core of their cultural identity. But for a lot of the incoming colonists, it was seen as an empty frontier. Untapped resources, ripe for the taking. These fundamentally different views were bound to clash.
One of the first flashpoints, and it's mentioned in several sources, is the Pemmican Proclamation of 1814. Basically, it banned the export of pemmican, which was it was vital for the Métis, right? Both as a
Yeah.
food source and a trade good. What made this such a big deal?
Well, pemmican, it wasn't just food. It was central to their economy, a source of wealth and independence. And this ban, imposed by a colonial power with zero Metis consent, it was a direct threat to their entire way of life. It showed them very clearly their lack of political power, and it fueled resentment, of course.
And then you have Lord Selkirk arriving with his Scottish settlers in the Red River area. It feels like that just added another layer of tension to an already volatile situation.
Oh, absolutely. This sudden influx of settlers, it meant more competition for land, for resources. And the Métis, who had established communities, farms in the Red River Valley, they were facing the very real threat of being pushed out. Can you imagine that anxiety, that fear?
And that all came to a head in 1816 with the Battle of Seven Oaks. It's described as this violent clash between the Métis and Selkirk's colonists. And in many ways, it felt like a turning point. The Métis showed their strength, their willingness to defend their homeland.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment, this battle where 21 colonists and one Métis lost their lives. It really demonstrated their determination. The Métis, they fought alongside their First Nations kin, even country-born Métis joined the fight, and they won. They showed everyone they were a force to be reckoned with.
But, as the sources suggest, this victory also kind of set the stage for future conflicts. It's clear that the Battle of Seven Oaks, it wasn't the end. It was really just the beginning of a long and difficult struggle for the Métis to secure their place in a rapidly changing West.
And then you have the Red River Resistance of 1869-70, probably one of the most important moments in Métis history. A lot of our sources point to this feeling of betrayal, this fear of being completely absorbed by Canada.
The sale of Rupert's land seems to be the real catalyst here. This massive territory, which included the Red River settlement, was just handed over to Canada. No consultation, no regard for the people who actually lived there.
It's pretty shocking when you think about it. The Métis, the First Nations, they saw it as a complete disregard for their rights. It must have been terrifying not knowing what the future held.
Yeah, the sources really drive home that fear of assimilation. It wasn't just about losing land, it was about losing their language, their religion, their whole way of life.
Right, and it was happening all around them. More and more Anglophone settlers arriving, English institutions taking root. The pressure to conform was immense.
And then in 1869, Canadian surveyors actually show up and start dividing the land. They seem to completely ignore the Métis' traditional system of river lots.
Ah.
That must have felt like a line in the sand.
Oh, absolutely. It was symbolic for sure, but it also had very real consequences. They were literally redrawing the map, imposing a new order without any regard for the Métis. It was a huge provocation.
And this is where Louis Riel takes center stage. He was a charismatic leader, well-educated, and he really pushed for the Métis to unite and defend their homeland.
Riel understood the stakes, that's for sure. He urged his people to stand up for their rights, and he was willing to take action. I mean, he helped form a provisional government, taking control of the Red River settlement, and he spearheaded the creation of the Métis Bill of Rights.
Yeah, that Bill of Rights is fascinating. It lays out this vision for a more inclusive society, one where the Métis are recognized as a distinct people with rights. They demanded land rights, language rights, political representation. They even advocated for the protection of First Nations rights.
It was an incredibly forward-thinking document, especially for the time. It directly challenged the Canadian government and presented a clear vision for Métis self-determination within Confederation.
But then, of course, you have the execution of Thomas Scott, an Ontario Protestant who had been arrested by Riel's government. That event really polarized opinion across Canada, right?
Absolutely. It exposed the deep divisions between English and French Canada. For many in Ontario, Scott's execution was seen as an act of rebellion, and they wanted revenge. But in Quebec, there was a lot of sympathy for the Métis. They were seen as defenders of Francophone and Catholic rights in the West.
It really highlights how the Métis struggle was part of a much bigger story, these larger anxieties about national unity and cultural identity in Canada at the time. Their fight became a focal point for all of that.
Right, and it's in this really tense climate that the Manitoba Act of 1870 is passed. It officially creates the province of Manitoba and addresses some of the Métis concerns, but it wasn't a complete victory by any means.
It feels like a compromise, but one with a pretty high cost. The Manitoba Act did guarantee bilingualism, a Catholic school system, and some land for the Métis, but it fell short of their demands for self-government and real control over their territory.
And even the promises that were made, well, they weren't always kept. The land grants were often mismanaged, and the influx of Anglophone settlers just kept coming. That vision of a truly bilingual, bicultural province, it was fading.
And then you have Louis Riel, the very person who led the movement that resulted in Manitoba's creation, forced into exile in the U.S. to avoid being prosecuted. What a slap in the face.
The Red River Resistance, it did achieve some important things, but it also left these deep wounds. For the Métis, it was a harsh reminder that their fight for recognition and self-determination, well, it was far from over. They had fought for their place in Canada, but their future was still uncertain.
And that uncertainty, I think, leads us right into the next chapter, the Northwest Resistance of 1885. So here we are, the 1880s. And for a lot of Métis, it must have felt like, I don't know, a betrayal of the promises made. They fought for their rights, they were part of creating Manitoba, but they were still facing so much discrimination. And the government, well, it often felt like they didn't care.
Yeah, and by this point, a lot of Métis had moved west, trying to find new opportunities, maybe escape some of the pressures to assimilate they faced in Manitoba. But what did they find? The same problems, right? Treaties being broken, the buffalo almost gone. That feeling of being ignored, of not having a voice.
Yeah, and a lot of the sources, they describe this growing desperation. The Métis struggling to survive, sending petitions, but getting no response. This sense of injustice brewing. It almost feels like, well, like they were set up for another confrontation.
And that confrontation came in 1885, the Northwest Resistance. But we have to be careful not to see this as just a repeat of the Red River Resistance. The context was different, the grievances had evolved, but the core issue, that struggle for recognition, for self-determination, that remained the same.
And once again, Louis Riel becomes a central figure. He'd returned from exile, drawn back by the Métis, who saw him as, well, almost a symbol of hope, someone who could speak for them, fight for them.
Riel is such a complex figure, even controversial, but his influence is undeniable. He and Gabriel Dumont, a skilled Métis military leader, they were able to really rally the Métis and their First Nations allies. They were ready to defend their way of life, whatever the cost.
But the Northwest resistance, and this is clear in all the sources, it ended in tragedy. They had some early victories, but in the end, they were defeated by the Canadian forces. And Riel, he was captured, tried for treason, and executed in 1885. It was a devastating blow to the Métis, and it really shook Canada as a whole.
Rael's execution, it's one of those moments that just divides people. For many Métis and French Canadians, he became this martyr, a symbol of their struggle against injustice. But for others, he was a traitor, a rebel who challenged the government. And that debate, it continues to this day.
And for the Métis, the years that followed were incredibly difficult. More marginalization, more land loss, and government policies that were really focused on assimilation. Even the scrip system, which was supposed to compensate them for their land, it was a mess. Many Métis were forced to sell their scrip for next to nothing.
A really dark time. Broken promises piled on top of defeat. The Métis saw their traditional ways of life disappearing, their leaders were gone, and any hope for self-determination seemed lost.
But the sources also show something else, something amazing. The resilience of the Métis people. They never gave up. They kept adapting, preserving their culture, raising their families, keeping their communities going.
And in the 20th century, you start to see this resurgence of Métis activism. That push for recognition gains momentum again. Organizations are formed, fighting for their rights, celebrating their heritage, demanding their rightful place in Canada.
One of the sources even mentions a major legal victory in 2016. The Supreme Court of Canada. They recognized the federal government's responsibility to the Métis. A huge win, the result of decades of activism. A real step forward.
It's a story that's still being written, right? The Métis are still fighting for their identity to be recognized, for control over their land and resources, for a future where their culture can thrive.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways? What have we learned from this history with all its complexity and tragedy?
Well, I think the Métis story teaches us a few crucial things. It reminds us that history isn't neat and tidy. It's messy, full of conflict and change, and often a lot of pain. It asks us to face those injustices of the past head on and work towards a better, more just future for everyone.
It also challenges our ideas about identity. The Métis, with their mix of cultures and traditions, they don't fit neatly into those boxes we often create, Indigenous, European, Canadian. Their story pushes us to embrace diversity, to value that richness that comes from cultural exchange.
And maybe most important of all, the Métis story is about resilience. It's about perseverance, about hope. They faced incredible hardships, but never surrendered that fight for recognition and self-determination. It's inspiring, really. Even when things seem impossible, the human spirit, it finds ways to adapt, to resist, and to endure.
This has been, wow, an incredible journey. Thank you for taking us through this deep dive into Métis history, a story that every Canadian should know.